Good morning and or afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this A-Push Nation. Mr. Majewski here. First off, I want to wish everybody a very happy President's Day. Stop for a moment and think about the amazing contributions of our presidents, in particular Washington and Lincoln, who this is based on. But more importantly than that, we need to get to our review, right? And we're going to be reviewing Reconstruction and Gilded Age today for our exam. And I'm going to try to go pretty quickly because obviously there's a lot of information and I know you guys have limited time between all your classes. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with the Reconstruction Notes, all right? And let's go through these, all right? Okay, what was the Freedmen's Bureau and Black Codes each designed to do? Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau was developed by the United States government, in particular Congress, which was dominated by the Republican Party, remember, during and after the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to provide basics for recently freed African Americans. That would be food, that could be shelter, that could be clothing, that could be education, that could be jobs, all right? Or job training. The most famous example are probably freedmen's schools. They helped to educate hundreds of thousands of African American children after the war is over. If you remember, the Freedmen's Bureau was controversial because it was opposed so much by southern states. Even the president, Johnson, remember, tried to get rid of it multiple times. Eventually, it dies out in the early 1870s. And it's one of the reasons why Congress wants to seize control of Reconstruction back from Johnson during the Reconstruction era. Black codes were laws that were passed by southern states that restricted African Americans' opportunities and ability to move out of those states. Remember, it tried to tie African Americans to the land, how to do that. It basically forced them to sign contracts, right? Remember, that said you must work this land for this amount of time. You're not allowed to jump the contract or leave. If you do, they can go and get you and bring you back. Remember, your debt a lot of times is inherited in the Black Code system. So what, of course, that means is that if you acquired debt, you couldn't leave unless you paid it off. And, of course, that debt could be passed down to future generations as well. Again, it was passed because white Southerners were very fearful they would lose that steady supply of labor that they thought they needed in order for their system to work. And so this was supposedly, it's very restrictive, it's abusive, it's unfair. It's designed to keep African Americans in the South on those farms/plantations so that there's still a regular supply of work for white plantation slave owners. Number two, why did Congress seize control of... by the way, the Black Codes, back to number one, are one of the other reasons why Congress seizes control of Reconstruction, because remember, they were upset with the Black Codes. They were upset with what they thought were southern states' willingness to get around Congress's policies to improve the lives of African Americans. Number two, why did Congress seize control of Reconstruction policies and attempt to impeach Andrew Johnson? Okay, for the reasons I just talked about. Remember, they felt that Johnson was too lenient on southern states. He himself was a Southerner. Remember, he allowed them back into the country to be readmitted based on the 10% plan when they were out of session. Remember, Congress is upset that many of the old Southern leaders, the Confederate leaders, are voted right back into Congress again. They were angry about the Black Codes. They were angry about Johnson getting rid of the Freedmen's Bureau. And they just kind of felt like Johnson was helping the South to get by and get around Reconstruction policies without actually enforcing them. Eventually, remember, they win a supermajority in Congress, so they can override Johnson's vetoes. When that happens, Congress squarely becomes in charge of Reconstruction from that moment forward. Also, remember, they did attempt to impeach Johnson because they disagreed with him so much on policy for Reconstruction. Remember, what did they do? They passed the Tenure of Office Act, so that when he tried to dismiss one of his cabinet members, he technically broke a law so that they could impeach him. It failed, but it did come close. All right, so the relationship between Congress and the president during Reconstruction is a mess, at least until President Grant takes over. 3. What did the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in this country. All right, so it ended slavery. for all people, but in reality, it really was for African Americans because they were the only ones that were being used as such at the time. 14th Amendment granted all civil rights that other Americans had to people of color or to African Americans. What it says is, other people that are in the United States, and that was kind of supposed to be code for African Americans, would have the same rights that all other Americans do. That grants them the same equality to the first 10 laws, to the Bill of Rights and all of the amendments that come afterwards. And at least that's what it was designed to do. Remember, the 14th Amendment was difficult to get passed in the South, and it was very difficult to enforce there as well. The 15th Amendment grants freedom, the right to vote to African American men. Again, please remember, Southerners develop a number of ways to obstruct or to prevent this from taking place, especially after the Reconstruction period is over in 1868. I should say in 1876. In what ways did Southerners deny African American voting opportunities even after the 15th Amendment? Oh my goodness, there were a bunch of ways that they did. First off, if you remember, they established literacy tests, remember, where you had to be able to demonstrate you could read or write in order to vote. They passed poll taxes, remember, which you had to pay a fee in order to vote, right, if you recall that. Oh, they developed the grandfather clause, which basically was designed to limit newly freed African Americans from voting. Remember, you basically had to have been a citizen before a certain date before you could vote, and that date was prior to African Americans winning their freedom. All right, fear, intimidation. Remember, groups like the KKK lynched, attacked, harassed not only blacks but also, remember, whites, like carpetbaggers that came down from the north to help. Scallywags, remember, were Southerners that wanted to help African Americans. All of them were targeted by the Klan and by other groups. Lynchings were the most common threat that was used against both white and black supporter of African American rights. Other methods that were used, remember, they sometimes redraw districts. It's called gerrymandering, voting districts, to force blacks into one district or to always make them a minority in every one that African Americans live in, so it guarantees or gives advantages to whites to vote instead. All right, so poll taxes, literacy taxes, grandfather clauses, fear and intimidation. In some places, if you remember, they would try to outlaw or ban the Republican Party. All of these were pretty common methods used to try to prevent African American suffrage. Number 5, why was the election of 1876 so important in shaping race relations in the United States? Because the election of 1876, remember, nobody won the electoral majority, and so it went to the House. And if you recall, the Compromise of 1877 took place. The Republicans gave up on Reconstruction. They removed troops from the South, right, which was key to enforcing Reconstruction laws. When the military was there, the Republicans in Congress and the North could force the South to follow the rules. The moment they're gone, there's nobody there to enforce the rules anymore, and the South just ignored them. And there were so few people that stood up for African Americans in the South that the violation of their rights and their lack of equality became a permanent thing. So in 1876, the Republicans agree with the South. The Democrats in the South, the Republicans will keep the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected. In exchange for that, the Union troops or the federal troops are removed from southern states, which is considered the end of Reconstruction and the start of the Jim Crow era, where the African Americans are going to have another 100 years of abuse, mistreatment, inequality, of course, the federal government does very little to stop it. 6, what is the major difference between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois? Okay. Remember, Washington believed and accepted, I guess you could say, social segregation. I remember he used the analogy of a hand. He said, hey, when it comes, I want education and job opportunities for African Americans, just like whites have. He described that as like the palm of your hand. All right, everybody is together in the palm. But he said when it came to social separation, segregation, Jim Crow laws, we would accept those, like the fingers on the hand. So we need to be together when it comes to education and jobs. But and if you give us that, African Americans are given that, Washington said, then they'll accept social segregation. They'll allow themselves to be separated from society elsewhere. You don't like that, huh, Guinea Bear? I know, I don't either, big boy. That was Washington. It was known as accommodation. It was provided at a very famous speech called the Atlanta Compromise speech. He was ridiculed by many for kind of giving in too much to whites and allowing themselves to be separated. His attitude was education and employment are the key, and they will help us to achieve social equality down the road. He was famous for establishing all black universities. The most famous was Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and yeah, and so he thought that was the best means of achieving equality in the long run. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in absolute equality. He wanted across-the-board equality, social, political, economic. He challenged Washington, said Washington didn't ask for enough. Remember, W.E.B. Du Bois said also that the talented tenth, the top 10% of African American society, ought to be granted full equality immediately so that they could fight for the remaining 90% to get those rights as quickly as possible. Du Bois founded, if you remember, the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was originally made up of whites and blacks that wanted absolute equality for African Americans. Eventually, the Niagara Movement turns into the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That is one of the leading civil rights groups throughout history and all the way up till today. Remember, their preferred method is to use lawsuits, the legal system, the courts, to challenge what they consider to be unfair or unethical laws. Number 7, describe what Jim Crow laws were designed to do and name the Supreme Court case that upheld them. Jim Crow laws were designed to separate whites from blacks in society. In any public space, in any public setting, whites and blacks were generally segregated or excluded from one another. So train stations, there was a white and black section. Train cars, there were whites and blacks cars. Movie theaters, restaurants, stores, entrances to places, restrooms, any public area or setting could be segregated and was segregated. So essentially you had two separate societies. You had white society, you had black society. Of course, while the facilities were technically equal in that they provided the same basic function, the luxuries, the amenities were usually much nicer in the white area or the white section than they were the black. And so it was inherently unfair. It was naturally unfair. You could tell immediately by looking at them one was better than the other, but according to the basic purpose, for instance, providing water or washing your hands, you had the same opportunity at both. And that's why the court upheld it. They said yes, as long as a person has access to the facility that they're using and has basic functions, and that is legal, the state can exclude or segregate you. The case, of course, was Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson. That upheld separate but equal. Remember, Homer Plessy challenged the fact that he had to ride on a black train car. Ultimately, he lost. And this allowed for Jim Crow laws to be passed, to really explode in terms of the number, and to really allow blacks to be separated and discriminated against and victimized, again, for about the next, 50 to 60 years, until a second case, Brown versus Board of Education, finally overturned it. Hey, you need to remember one other name. I'm not sure she's on here. Ida Wells. She's the anti-lynching lady. Remember, she creates an anti-lynching campaign to try to draw attention to the fact that blacks are being hanged along with whites across the South simply for voting or speaking up on behalf of black equality. All right, Mr. Guinness is getting a little irritated here, so I got to put him down for a second. Give me one moment. All right, number 8, know the difference between types of trust, including pools, horizontal integration, vertical integration, interlocking directorates, and the business leader. Okay, so pools are simple. They were developed by the railroad industry, people like Cornelius Vanderbilt. A pool is a defensive alliance that is made up of corporations, corporate leaders, businessmen in an industry. And what it does is the businesses in an industry like railroads would team up if a new rival or a new competitor tried to join in that business. They want to eliminate rivals. They want to eliminate competitors. The less competitors they have, the better off they are, because they have less rivals to challenge with prices and things like that. And so a pool, remember, they would get together and they would secretly set their prices to be lower than any rivals, than any new companies, to try to force the new company out of business. Once the new company is out of business because they can't compete with the low prices that everybody else is paying, is charging, then they would raise their prices back up again to get as much profit as possible from the public. So again, you team up, you collude your prices, which means you work together on your prices with your other rivals to prevent a new company from joining. And then once the new company is out of business, right, you go right back to doing what you were doing, charge the highest price possible because you've eliminated that new competitor. Again, that was railroad industry. Vanderbilt, Gold, and Sage were our other two railroad tycoons that developed that strategy. Horizontal integration is developed by John D Rockefeller in the oil industry. Remember, horizontal integration is how Standard Oil, his company, became to have such a monopoly over oil. It's very simple. Remember, you buy out your rivals, all right? You purchase your rivals, you make them part of your own company, you would absorb or annex them into your company, you give them stock in your company, which is part ownership, in exchange for them selling their company to you. If they refuse to sell, remember, you team up with all of your businesses against them. You prevent them from having access to rail cars and things like that to get their products where they need to. You undercut their prices, you force them out of business, and then you buy the company anyways. So it's brutal, it's cutthroat, it's very, very effective in eliminating rivals, merging rivals into your own company, annexing them or absorbing them, so they're no longer a threat and you have greater control. Vertical integration developed by Andrew Carnegie. Remember, in the steel industry with Carnegie Steel, what does it do? You control all of the steps or stages or factors of production, from digging the product out of the ground to transporting it, to turning it into a finished product, to transporting it to market, and then to selling it at market. You own all those steps. You buy them, you purchase them, you control them. You don't have to pay middlemen. You don't have to pay other people for it. You get to keep all the profit for yourself because you're not sharing it or splitting it amongst the people that you have to pay off in order to produce the product. Finally, interlocking directorates developed by J.P. Morgan. He was a banker. And interlocking directorates, remember, are where you form a holding company that is made up of a board of directors. You appoint those people, those board of directors, to your holding company. They're technically in charge of all of your property, all of your companies. And then what you do is you appoint people to those boards of directors that control the companies that you want, and then you appoint them to the board of directors of other companies that you control as well, so that these individuals, these boards of directors, have control not only of the holding company, but they technically have control over a wide number of companies that they were already the CEO of as well. What that means is you're able, or you're allowed, to basically set, you're in charge of not only your companies, you're in charge of the holding company, you're in charge of all these other companies that your board of directors control as well. You don't even have to buy them. You just have to appoint these people to your holding company. They take orders from you, and then you have control over all of their companies that they sit on the board of directors on as well. So it's a way for you to really expand your coverage over a lot of industries without maybe buying each company in that industry, basically by controlling the decision makers, the people who make the decisions in those industries, through a very complicated and complex net of where you've appointed them to a bunch of different companies at the same time. Number 9, what were robber barons and who was considered to be the most famous? Robber barons was a term that was used to describe wealthy railroad executives who got super rich super quick And they oftentimes flaunted their wealth, or they lived rather extravagant lives because they had just gotten their money and they were kind of showing off. The term robber barons is a negative term, right? Because it assumes that the people have gotten really rich by robbing the people. They become almost like a nobility with their wealth by robbing the people or cheating them to get the most profit as possible. Originally, it meant railroad execs. Vanderbilt was one of the first. However, over time, it really comes to symbolize kind of all executives, all corporations, especially the nouveau rich, remember, who especially flaunted and showed that wealth off. What contribution did James Hill have on railroad growth? James Hill was the most famous railroad builder. He was a designer and engineer. He helped to construct the first transcontinental railroad, and then he was responsible for building multiple others, including the very famous Great Northern, which ran across the Canadian border. All right? So, hey, the transcontinental railroads don't get built without James Hill's support and ingenuity. Number 10, what were the largest specific corporations inside the United States when it came to steel? Originally Carnegie Steel, until it's bought out by J.P. Morgan, and then he forms U.S. Steel, which was the largest corporation in the world. Oil is Standard Oil, Rockefeller. Banking, J.P. Morgan as well, right? The Morgan's banking house, eventually it becomes J.P. Morgan Chase. Tobacco, the Duke family, right? American Tobacco. They controlled a monopoly on tobacco production. Folks, the two largest tobacco suppliers today are Camel and Marlboro. Those were both originally part of American Tobacco. Meatpacking, Gustavus Swift is considered to be the most famous of the meatpacking corporations. He's able to really use the integration that is developed by Carnegie and Rockefeller to dominate the meatpacking industry as well. Number 11, describe what the Sherman Antitrust Act was and its greatest weakness. Okay. So eventually the public gets really frustrated with these robber barons. They want their companies to be regulated. They want these huge trusts that that are formed of these monopolies to be broken up by the government because they think they're too big. They prevent competition and they hurt consumers by charging high prices. Congress wanted the public to think they were doing something to regulate trusts. And so they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. However, they wrote it intentionally weak, where they made it difficult to enforce. For instance, there was no punishment, there was no negative if a company did form a trust. And so what would happen is they passed the law to kind of convince the public they're doing something about it, but at the same time, Congress goes to the corporations, which are bribing them, which are paying them off, and basically say, hey, you don't have anything to worry about because, hey, we're not going to target you, we're not going to break you up. Even if you do form a trust, there's nothing written into the law that guarantees you'll be broken up, and we'll make sure the federal government doesn't regulate you. So there's no enforcement, all right? There's no punishment or penalty, and the government does not consistently break up the largest trusts, all right? They might pick on a few trusts here and there that they didn't like, to convince the public they're doing something, but the big mega trusts get ignored. All right, they do never get regulated like the law was supposed to do. All right, 12. Why did farmers especially oppose railroads? Well, because the railroads, remember, charged them unfair rates. Remember, railroads didn't particularly want to carry crops. They didn't make as much profit on them as they did carrying heavier goods. So remember, what railroads did is they charged long and short haul rates. Long haul rates were designed for corporations, industries. They were much cheaper per mile. Short haul rates were incredibly expensive. They were designed to prevent farmers from using the railroads because farmers generally only carried their goods shorter rates, shorter hauls, shorter distances. And so by charging as high a price as possible for that, railroads are trying to prevent the farmers from using the railroads. Well, the problem is farmers needed them. They needed to get their crops to market, but they were breaking themselves and breaking their companies in order to pay these ridiculous rates to even get their crops to market in time. All right, so they want them regulated because they feel like they specifically are being abused by railroads. Be able to explain the difference between the NLU, the Knights of Labor, and the AFL. What led to the demise of the first two? Well, National Labor Union is the first. It's not as large as the other two. The National Labor Union, their biggest issue, to be honest with you, first off, they are never huge, they're never large. They're made up mostly of unskilled workers, which is difficult to mobilize. They don't have as much power when they negotiate or bargain. Because they were the first, when the Panic of 1873 happened, remember, they get blamed for it by a lot of people. A lot of folks believed that these unions that were forming were dragging the economy down. They were hurting businesses, and they contributed to the panic. Because of that, a lot of folks lost support for National Labor Union. Some of them dropped out. They didn't want to be associated with this because they felt like being a member of this union would prevent them from being hired for future jobs. The Knights of Labor is founded by Terence Powderly. Remember, they fought. They were one big union, right? So unskilled together, which is a problem for them. They fought for a bunch of different things, not just the 8-hour workday. They want better working conditions. They want better living conditions. They want education for their children. So they fight for a number of things that had nothing to do with actual working conditions. That's another problem for them because they kind of don't achieve a lot of success, at least large success, specific success, because they're fighting for so many things at the same time. They're one big union, which is a problem as well, because a lot of times skilled workers didn't want to go on strike to support unskilled workers. Ultimately, they do gain popularity, but eventually that popularity goes away. If you remember, during the Haymarket Square riots, during the Great Upheaval, remember the Knights had called for a day of celebration, I guess you could say, for workers. What happens is the police go in to break it up. We know what happens. Anarchists that were in the crowd started throwing bombs at the police, led to a series of deaths. A lot of folks blamed the Knights for this violence, believed that the Knights were responsible for it, and that there were radicals, anarchists, communists, socialists that had infiltrated these unions and were part of them and were influencing their actions. And so popularity and support for the Knights goes down. In fact, they end up getting really targeted by the government for what were considered radical behavior. The last union you need to know is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, by far the most successful, run by Samuel Gompers. They are just one union, skilled union only. All right, so they do not have one big union. They separate skilled workers because they knew they could get more results if they used skilled workers because businesses considered them more valuable. They fight for bread and butter issues, right? 8-hour work days, overtime, maximum number of work hours in a week, better wages. They figured if they focused on and fought for the things that mattered to the workers most and specific things, they'd have greater success. They do. They're able to survive this period where a lot of other unions are broken up. They actually are going to get stronger and stronger through the Great Depression, and they are still around today, one of our largest unions, in fact, the largest union that exists today. 14, what were the 3 big strikes that occurred during the Gilded Age period, and what was the outcome of each? Okay, first you need to know is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was obviously organized by railway unions. They, blocked the railroads. They stopped working. They prevented traffic from moving on some railroads. Eventually, it is the precedent. Why is it significant? Well, it's the first major strike. Secondly, it's the first time the federal government ever used force to prevent a strike. The federal government under President Hayes sent in federal troops who clashed with the laborers, with the union members. Eventually, the union members were defeated and forced to go back to work. The second major strike you need to be familiar with is the Homestead Strike. That is in the steel industry. That's Carnegie Steel. It was a series of battles that were fought by strikers who locked themselves in the actual steel mill and guarded it with weapons. And so they got into a series of battles, I guess you could say, gunfights with private detectives that were hired by the company, which were called Pinkertons, and then state troops that were sent in to help the company, that were sent in to help the Pinkerton detectives. Eventually, the strike was broken. Most of the strikers were fired and replaced with new workers after the violence had died down. What it proved is that any powerful enough corporation working with the state officials was strong enough to defeat strikes at this point. So even though strikes are going to cause you problems, they're going to cause damage, they're going to cause your factory to shut down and not produce anything. Over time, the combination of government and businesses working together were almost always too strong and could always break a strike when they needed to. And that's what the Carnegie strike kind of showed us. The last is the Pullman Strike. The Pullman Strike was, again, the Pullman Car Company produced railroad cars. They were luxury, they were awesome, they were expensive, and so these workers felt like they were being treated unfairly. Their wages had been cut multiple times. They were having to pay high rents and things like that in their cities. They went on strike. Remember, they overturned rail cars. Eventually, it's broken as well. Why is it broken? Because remember, this time, the federal government and the courts use injunctions, legal orders, where the courts passed legal decisions that required workers to go back to work or else immediately be arrested and fired. It's the first time the federal government ever used injunctions, legal orders, court decisions to get people back to work again. Again, just another example about how government developed methods, strategies to help businesses defeat strikes because government was clearly on the side of business. They were clearly on the side of labor in terms of the decisions they made. Even when they passed things like Sherman Antitrust, remember, they passed them in a way where the law was flawed enough where it couldn't actually be used to break up the businesses. 15. What were some of the early tactics that were used by labor unions during the Gilded Age period? Okay, well, they would use strikes, right, where everybody stopped working as a sign of protest to show to the bosses, hey, we're more valuable than you think, and if without us, your business will not run. They would use boycotts where they would convince the public, to not purchase a product to protest the fact that its workers were not being treated fairly. Sometimes they would use things like walkouts, where they would just walk out for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or for a day, almost like a mini strike without the violence, just to kind of send a warning, to send a message, hey, we're gonna not work for 30 minutes or an hour, so you can see if we go on a real strike down the road, how damaging that could be to you. Almost like a threat, all right? They used the closed shop, remember. The closed shop was where all members in an industry that got hired had to join the union. That gave the union more power. And, of course, remember collective bargaining. That's where union members voted for leaders who went and negotiated contracts on behalf of everybody. This is important because if the union is negotiating on behalf of all workers, then they don't have to worry that some workers are going to go and accept less money or negotiate a different contract than everybody else and then weaken their bargaining position that they have with the company. All right? 16, who were the nouveau rich in American society and why were they criticized? Again, these were the new, young, wealthy Americans who had gotten their fortunes through some of these new industries. And they flaunted, they showed off, they lived extravagant lives. They were both kind of looked up to and looked down on at the same time. A lot of Americans resented them, looked down on them for being kind of rich and extravagant and kind of bragging about how much money they had. Well, at the same time, a lot of folks tried to copy them, emulate them, because they wanted to be a little bit like them as well. They wanted to make a fortune and strike it rich. Remember, older, wealthier Americans who had their money longer really looked down on the nouveau rich because they thought that they gave all wealthy people a bad reputation, a bad name in this country. 17. What were the following Gilded Age authors? Who were the following Gilded Age authors, journalists, and artists? What were they known for? I can't even read. All right. 17. Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger wrote a series of rags to riches books that talked about these poor Americans and immigrants who, through good, hard work, through following the American way, through being religious, for doing the right thing, they all struck it rich and became filthy rich by the end of the book. So they're called rags to riches books. They were motivating. They inspired people to be to work hard and to try to, become a Carnegie or a Rockefeller down the road. They also were a little bit nativist in that they really encouraged people to assimilate, to blend into society, and to reject their cultural past. Thomas Nast, is the cartoonist who criticizes a number of things. He criticizes corporations, he criticizes Jim Crow laws, he criticized Democrats in the South like the KKK. He was also kind of harsh on immigrants who he thought needed to blend or assimilate into society. He was anti-Catholic. He's our most famous political cartoonist. He really wanted to see reforms passed that got rid of a lot of the corruption, greed, political machines, things like that in society. Henry George is another reformer. He called for basically kind of a redistribution of wealth, where he basically said that the wealthy's money should be taken and spread more evenly around to the lower classes. He was controversial, a radical reformer who wanted to see money or wealth really spread more evenly across society. All right, so he's kind of an early socialist in this country. Winslow Homer was a famous painter, artist. He's kind of considered the best artist from this time. He wrote kind of very dark, realist, he painted dark, realist settings, dark images that kind of depicted society and cities as they really were. So a lot of deep, dark, ominous colors, a lot of things that's supposed to represent like confusion and pollution and kind of maybe the hard, tough life that Americans were suffering during the time. Very different from the romantic artists like the Hudson River people who painted with bright colors and optimism and hope. Homer's were a little bit more realistic and a little bit harsher. He was known a lot of the times as well for maritime pictures, paintings, ocean settings, especially the deep power, the darkness of the ocean itself. All right. Mark Twain, Stephen Crane are the two most famous writers from this time. They're considered realist writers as well. They depict uniquely American life, especially out west in the Midwest and in the western states. They were humorous. They used a lot of description, a lot of detail, and they're really kind of the guys that take over for the previous generations of writers in this country, and really are a link between the writers of the past, like the Knickerbockers, and the writers we're going to get in the early 1920s and 30s when American literature really has its greatest era. All right? Mark Twain is considered by many to be maybe the best writer in American history. 18, know the difference between social gospel, gospel of wealth, and social Darwinism. Social gospel, remember, is where Protestant reformers wanted to go out and improve the ills of society, specifically within cities. So they developed movements like, temperance. They developed healthcare, settlement houses, so that they would go into urban areas, into cities, and try to improve the lives of the poorest immigrants, usually women and children, especially folks who it seemed like did not have the same protections and opportunities as everybody else in society. The Gospel of Wealth was an idea that was developed by Carnegie and was adopted by a lot of different wealthy Americans, that the wealthiest people in this country ought to give back some of their wealth to improve society. Now, not with direct money, not with welfare, not by handing money out to people or donating it directly to them, but by building things like parks, like schools, like universities, like libraries, like museums, like concert halls, things that would contribute to the public good and would raise kind of the cultural and educational backgrounds of people to kind of be a permanent way to give back and improve society that way. They didn't believe in direct assistance. They thought that made people lazy and dependent, and so they wanted to give back in ways that they thought would benefit society as a whole. The problem, of course, is while these are amazing ways to give back, a lot of people are just struggling to survive during this time. And so therefore, a concert hall or a museum doesn't help people directly, which is the assistance that a lot of the poorest people in this country needed at that time. Social Darwinism is a very different philosophy. It's the idea that God had endowed certain people with strength or ability or intelligence or superiority, and that those people were the ones that had success in life. So the wealthy people in this society were simply better or superior to everybody else, and that's why they had the money they did, and that's why they deserved it, and they ought to be able to get as much money as possible. It's kind of an elitist, obviously, philosophy. It's a philosophy that justifies why there's so much wealth in the hands of so few. It was also considered a nativist philosophy because the idea here was that you should try to emulate or copy these people's lives and live the same life that they did. You should assimilate. You should become Protestant. And that would be your greatest strength or advantage in terms of achieving success throughout life. Number 19, what was the women's Christian temperance movement? Who led it? The WCTU was led by Frances Willard. It was an all-women's organization that originally tried to prevent alcohol usage in this country. They tried to convince people to drink less. Eventually, it turns into a much larger women's movement that fought for women's rights and equality because it got to be so powerful. Why was it powerful? It was powerful because it had a huge membership of women. And secondly, because over time, they developed success by organizing boycotts where they would not purchase products. They would avoid companies and products if they believed those companies were not respecting women's equality and women's rights. So they hurt these companies where it matters most in their profits, all right, by not using those products anymore. What was their relationship with the Anti-Saloon League? The Anti-Saloon League was mostly run by men. The Women's Christian Temperance movement was run by women. The Anti-Saloon League generally focused more on political change. They tried to pass laws that prevented prohibition, that supported prohibition, that prevented alcohol consumption. They usually had more success because there were men in the organization that worked with other male politicians, whereas the WCTU is made up mostly of women, and they focused more on boycotts and kind of protests, rallies, that sort of stuff instead. All right. So the point here is the temperance and prohibition movement is kind of divided at this time. And the real reason why they're divided is gender. Are men and women going to be allowed to work together, or should they work separately for their goals? 20, what was the difference between old and new immigration into the United States? What factors in Europe and the U.S. led to new immigration? Okay, well, remember, old immigration was immigration from places like England, places like, Ireland and Germany. Those had been the immigrants up to this point, up till the Civil War in American society. And then really beginning after the Civil War, we see what are called new immigrants. Those are the people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Those are mostly Catholics and Jews and Orthodox Christians. They speak new languages. They didn't blend into society as much or as well as previous groups. And so because of that, they were targeted by nativists who wanted to see their numbers reduced and wanted to see them assimilate or blend more into society. What factors in Europe and the U.S. led to new immigration? Well, in Europe, we have a series of political revolutions in Europe, which pushed a lot of farmers out of those countries and motivated them to come to the United States. We saw some crop failures, like in Ireland and other places. In the United States, we have a massive demand for workers. We need workers in American cities in order to continue industrializing, and we had a bunch of available land in the Midwest and out West, which is a major attraction to people who could acquire it. 21, what role did each of the following play in addressing some problems brought on by urbanization, and what leaders do we associate with each? Okay, settlement house movement. Settlement houses were buildings, sometimes entire city blocks, that were basically like compounds. They were like, there would be places for people to stay. There might be a school. There would be gyms, maybe. There would be playgrounds. So it's almost in a way like big old apartment complex that provides a bunch of functions and facilities to women and children. That's who they were designed for. They were designed to help women and children in cities who might be homeless or didn't have the same opportunity, who were struggling to survive because of all these changes happening in our urban America. Jane Addams is our most famous settlement house leader. She ran a very famous settlement house in Chicago called Hull House. Florence Kelley is another famous settlement house leader in New York. They were women that wanted to improve the situation for other women and children by providing them, shelter, education. They would oftentimes provide them like cooking skills, cooking training, job skills, anything that they thought would improve their everyday lives and give them a better chance to survive and succeed in American cities. The American Red Cross, Clara Barton founds it. She's a nurse from the Civil War. It provided basic healthcare, health services to people living in urban areas who otherwise couldn't afford it. All right, so basic medical care, medical treatment. They also provided things like soup kitchens, which fed people who otherwise couldn't afford a meal. Just the basics, right, to keep people going, to keep them surviving, because times are tough in many cities for poor people during this time. How are we doing here? We're about halfway through, not so bad. What were some of the major inventions that spurred industry and urbanization during the Gilded Age? Oh my goodness, there were so many of them, to be honest with you. But I'm just going to get into some of them, all right? Well, steel, right, is a huge one. Railroads are another major invention. Oh my goodness, especially the Transcontinental Railroad. The telegraph is a major invention, of course, later to be replaced by the telephone. Everything from elevators, right, to skyscrapers, all of these things. Streetcars, like trolley cars, which were really popular during this time. So it looks like I kind of answer it in the second part of this question, where I go through all these amazing inventions. Skyscrapers, right, allow you to build massive buildings in cities. It takes advantage of expensive land because you build up instead of out. With the development of steel, we could build taller and taller skyscrapers, which means more and more business functions can occur under one roof, which is more efficient, right? Gets things done faster. Suspension bridges allow us to transport people and goods across major rivers and obstacles that previously had been unable to do so. What that means is that we can move goods and people much faster than ever before, more efficiently through the shortest routes. Which is a major boost for production in this country. Streetcars and subways were built in many American cities. They were designed to move people around with mass transportation, right, to avoid traffic and other problems. They were a massive industrial change. A lot of them couldn't happen without electricity, right? Electricity is probably the most famous of the inventions we needed for all of these others. Refrigerated rail cars as well were major things. Telephone, right, obviously massively improves our communication ability, which makes it easier for people to stay in contact, communication. Business deals are better able to get done. The typewriter obviously allows us to provide paper records and receipts, legal documents faster than ever before. Cash registers, right, allow people to buy and sell goods faster than ever before. It was an exciting time to be alive. You had all of these amazing inventions around you. At the same time, it was a very difficult time to be alive because it was hard living and hard working for many people who were struggling to just get by. All right? I will say one thing. The development of the typewriter, the telephone, the cash register were all major inventions for women. Young women in particular were able to take new jobs, telephone operators, secretaries, salespeople in stores, thanks to the development of the telephone, the typewriter, and the cash register. 23. What did the Chinese Exclusion Act do? And which state was largely responsible? The Chinese Exclusion Act cut off all Chinese immigration into the United States. It was passed in 1887. Who was responsible for it? It was the state of California more than anybody else, because they were the ones where most Chinese immigrants were settling. They really convinced the United States government that they were being overrun. Nativists here were really harsh on Chinese immigrants, portrayed them very negatively. And ultimately, That's what it did. They prevented Chinese immigration all the way until the late 1930s. Eventually, Japanese immigrants and others were also included into it to prevent them from coming as well. Moving over to the settlement of the American West, and that means that we are moving to what are the major plains and western Indian tribes that resisted the U.S. military? Well, you need to know the Sioux, in particular, in the Great Plains region, right? They are the bison hunters, they are the buffalo hunters, right? They are the ones in the teepees that are following their herds around. They were fierce horsemen and warriors, and they were considered to be kind of the toughest target, I guess you could say, of the American military. We also have groups like the Apache, the Comanche, the Navajo, which were generally located in the southwestern United States and the Rocky Mountains. And then up in the northwest, we have, the Shoshone and we have the Nez Perce, who were other groups that had resisted along the way. There are hundreds of other tribes. We just focus on the Sioux, and the Apache as kind of our perfect examples, our best examples of resistance. 25, who was Helen Hunt Jackson. She was an author. She wrote a very famous book, Century of Dishonor. And it chronicled the abuse that Native Americans had suffered at the hands of the U.S. government. Basically, one by one, told the stories of how the tribes had been lied to, cheated, killed off, wiped out. What impact did it have? Well, remember, it caused many Americans to believe that we needed to fix these problems, help Native Americans. It led to a Native American reform movement. Unfortunately, that reform movement, if you remember, focused on assimilation, right? Forcing Native Americans to become more like whites in an effort to protect Native Americans from being wiped out. 26 described the three most famous industries associated with the American West. Mining, right? Mining, originally it was gold and silver. Eventually it becomes more like copper and zinc and nickel as the most important products that are produced. It was really important out west. Corporations came to dominate the industry, and obviously the mines were connected through a series of railroad networks. Next up is cattle ranching. Cattle ranching developed out west. Large herds of cattle are allowed to graze throughout most of the year. When it was time to have them, slaughtered, they would hire cowboys. Cowboys would drive the cattle up to the nearest railroad depot, right? They would herd them and take them up to the nearest railroad depot, where the cattle would be loaded onto train cars, sent to slaughterhouses to be killed, which could then be turned into meat products on the East Coast. And then, of course, farming, Western farming, long-distance Western farming, right? We're going to be able to grow food crops, corn, grain, for instance, that can now be shipped by train, right, to factories to be turned into finished goods. Just like mining, ranching, and farming became dominated by corporations out west. We have really a lot of mechanization, more machines than ever before. We have large farms that develop, which really oftentimes dominated and swallowed up the small farmers. All right? All three industries obviously depend on the railroad for their survival. 27. Who was Frederick Jackson Turner, and what was his frontier hypothesis? Turner was a historian. He came up with a very famous history theory that he developed after going through the 1890 census. Remember, the census records all of our population and our movement and our legal changes and all that stuff, and we do it every 10 years. And what Jackson Turner said was, hey, by 1890, the frontier is gone. What that means is that there's no more available land that people can acquire, that it already had been taken up by homestead farmers or by corporations, or that the government was holding on to it. So what he said was, hey, this is a turning point because we no longer have Western lands available, and people are going to need to figure out how they are going to achieve the American dream from this point forward, because the land that many of them had always hoped to acquire is, quite frankly, no longer there. All right? So it's kind of a pessimistic theory, and a theory that, like, hey, we're going to have to redefine who we are and what we consider to be success in the future, because the old measure that we used, acquiring land, is not going to be available to a lot of people in the future. And so we're going to have to come up with other methods, other ways of trying to achieve the American dream in the future. All right, the safety valve theory you can ignore from number 27. You can cross it out. We don't need to know it. 28. Why was the Battle of Wounded Knee such an important event in American history? Well, because, Wounded Knee is technically the last example of armed resistance between Native Americans and the U.S. military. It happens in 1890. It's the end of about 22 straight years of conflict between different natives and the U.S. When the U.S. wipes out the Sioux who were performing the ghost dance at Wounded Knee, that is a symbolic end to our fighting with natives, because there's, quite frankly, no more natives left who can resist. They've all been wiped out at this point, or they've been forced onto reservations. And so they particularly struggle, and this is kind of a turning point. This is the last resistance we see. They've all finally been subjugated out west, just like they already had in the East Coast, on the East Coast and in the Midwest. 29. What did the Dawes Severalty Act do, and what effect did it have on Native society? Remember, the Dawes Severalty Act took Indian lands. It took ownership of those lands away. They no longer had legal decision-making over those lands. And then the government chopped up Indian lands into 160-acre parcels. They gave them to the head of household of each Indian family. And they said, hey, family, if you guys behave like a typical American family, if you farm that land, if you adopt English, if you reject your religion and your cultural traditions and your customs, if you assimilate into American society, eventually that land will become your own. It'll become your family's, and you'll be full-fledged citizens. Remember, the whole idea was they wanted them to become American farming families because they believed this was the best way to protect them. If they assimilated and became like whites, it would prevent whites from abusing them, taking advantage of them in the future. Of course, remember, the biggest problem here is that Native American men didn't want to farm. They hated it, right? They considered it women's work. So they're being forced to really change every aspect of their lives in order to try to survive around people that didn't really want them there behaving like Indians. What does it lead to? It leads to the destruction of a lot of Indian culture. Remember, kids, for instance, are removed from a lot of these homes and sent to boarding schools that are run by the military that were English only. So this connection that people had to their traditional languages and religions and cultural practices is cut off, is lost. About 2/3 of Indian lands as well are taken and never given back. All right, so Dawes was pretty harsh. What federal policies of the Gilded Age helped to encourage settlement of the West? Oh, okay. Well, we've got the Pacific Railway Act, right? The Transcontinental Railroad is massively important in building new towns and cities, right, that were connected to the railroad. The Homestead Act, which massively opened up, if you remember, homestead farmers, right, who are able to settle in these areas, oftentimes for the first time. What else do we have? We have the Morrill Land Grant Act, remember, which for lands that Western states sold, part of that went to fund education. It went to fund new colleges as well. So the Morrill Land Grant Act is another boost because it gave money for the development of education in a lot of these new Western states. Let's get to 31. Describe what political machines were and name the most famous example. The political machines, remember, were one political party controlled and dominated all decision-making, all operations within a particular city. They were so powerful and so dominant that they controlled politics there. They had voted out or eliminated their rivals. And so there's really only one party, and they catered to immigrants usually. They would provide benefits or services to immigrants in exchange for their votes. A lot of the eastern cities, like New York and Philadelphia, were dominated by one political party, and that party's operations were known as a political machine. They were corrupt, they were greedy. They did provide a lot of services to immigrants, but they're technically doing so in order to get those immigrants' votes. Sometimes they would pay for those votes. They would provide jobs, housing, services like garbage pickup, in exchange for immigrants voting. A lot of other Americans viewed it as corrupt, that they were technically buying votes from people. The most famous example of a political machine, New York City, Tammany Hall. The Democratic Party controlled politics in New York City. It was dominated by Irish politicians who operated from a building known as Tammany Hall. And so the machine was simply known as Tammany Hall in New York. It was run by one man, a guy named Boss Tweed, William Tweed. 32, why was the Interstate Commerce Act significant in American history? It was the first time that the government ever tried to effectively regulate railroads. Well, effectively regulate corporations of any type. They tried to regulate railroads. It was designed to prevent railroads from charging unfair rates to farmers and other groups. It was designed to eliminate rebates, which were free rides for politicians and for the media. Why did it fail? Well, for the same reason that the Sherman Antitrust Act did, because it wasn't effectively enforced. If a company violated these laws, there was nothing written in place that guaranteed they would be broken up or targeted by the government, and so the government passed the law but rarely actually enforced it. They rarely actually regulated railroads like they were supposed to. 33. How did the Slaughterhouse cases, the Wabash case, and Munn v. Illinois support business over farmers and laborers? Okay, well, first off, slaughterhouse cases were a series of decisions by the courts that said corporations had the same rights as individuals. They had the same protections under the Constitution, so it prevented a lot of times corporations from having lawsuits filed against them. It protected them from abuse, from discrimination, because it gave them legal rights, just like you or I would have according to the Constitution. The Munn v. Illinois was actually a case where courts decided to support the farmer. They said that the rates being charged farmers were unfair and that states had the right to regulate these rates if the federal government would not. However, the court changed and reversed its decision in Wabash. In the Wabash case, the court said, wait a minute, the railroads travel across multiple states, and when that happens, that's interstate commerce. And so states do not have the right to regulate interstate commerce according to the Constitution. And so Wabash kind of overturned Munn, which means that where Munn gave farmers hope and optimism that they might actually be able to regulate railroads for the first time, Wabash squashed that. It killed that hope, that dream. All right. Who was Henry Grady and what did he advocate for Southerners? Henry Grady was a newspaper editor. He lived in the South. He's promoted what was called the New South, where he said, hey, we need to develop our own industry. We need to, yes, still rely on agriculture, but we have to industrialize. We have to develop our own industries like the cotton mills, like tobacco, to turn into cigarettes if we're ever going to compete with the North. What he said was, we got to be more like the North. We got to industrialize. We got to build factories. We have to stop being so dependent on agriculture if we ever want to make the wealth that we need to in order to be the rival of the northern states. Why didn't it happen? Well, a number of reasons. Because the South is still too agricultural. They didn't have a lot of money, capital to invest in industry. And they're focused a lot more on keeping or maintaining their agricultural system, where blacks were forced to be sharecroppers that worked for whites. 35, what was an exoduster and how were they able to leave the South? An exoduster was an African American who fled the South to take advantage of homestead farms in the Midwest. So they were able to escape the Jim Crow laws, the discrimination, the racism. How were they able to do so? Because some qualified for homestead farms out west, and they moved to places like Kansas and Nebraska in an effort to try to make it for themselves and to own land and to establish their own independent farm. All right. 36, what were some of the economic complaints that farmers had during the 1890s? My goodness, there are a lot of them. Railroads are unfair, right? Railroads tended to harm them with their unfair rates. Banks charged them ridiculous loans and ridiculous interest rates. A lot of times they couldn't even get loans from banks, and they're going perpetually further and further into debt every single year. The machines for agriculture are expensive. A lot of farmers couldn't afford them. They had to borrow even more. They felt like they were being cheated, like agricultural trusts were charging them higher rates than they ought to, unfair prices. Remember, they really don't trust the banks. They don't trust railroads. They don't trust agricultural corporations. And more importantly, they don't trust the government because they think the government is defending all three of those groups instead of defending them. So they have a number of complaints, and rightfully so. Never mind the fact that there are a number of environmental issues like droughts that affect farmers during this time, and they have no political representation. They feel like nobody is standing up for them because all of the Senate and other groups tend to benefit the wealthy industrialist. 37. What was the Grange and Farmers Alliances, and what did they attempt to achieve? So these are early attempts by farmers to become more politically active. Now, originally, both of these groups were kind of like social and educational groups. They provided opportunities for farmers to get together and to just kind of hang out and engage in social, relationships. Like dances, like picnics, that sort of stuff. Eventually, they started to work together. They let farmers team up and maybe buy their seeds at the same time, where they could pool their money and get cheaper prices. They developed what are called cooperatives, where farmers sold their products together, to industries, so that they generally, because they were selling more at one time, they got better prices for doing so. Over time, the Grange and Farmers Alliances start to become involved in politics. They started to elect representatives from their groups into Congress, into state and national Congress positions. And eventually their goal is to gain better representation, equality for farmers. And if you remember, to try to get the government and corporations to treat them more fairly with more respect. 38. Which groups made up the populace and what were their goals? Populists were made up of a lot of the farmers, people that had been in the Grange and Farmers Alliances. It also was made up of some workers as well. Labor unions, for instance, would also join the populists. Their goals, my goodness, there's a large number of things they want to achieve. They'd like to see us move more towards a silver standard. They want to see us produce more silver. They thought that would cause inflation, which would raise the value of their crops. And that silver was more affordable than gold, so that they could actually afford to buy some of it. All right. They want to see postal savings banks. They want to see the post office provide banking functions. They wanted to see a sub-treasury plan where our Treasury Department would give them loans so that they didn't have to go to banks. Remember, they don't trust banks, so they want to use the government's post offices. They want to use the government's Treasury Department in order to get the loans they need, so that they didn't have to deal with banks any longer. They want to see railroad regulated. They want to see the government take over industries like the railroads and run them themselves, so that they would run more fairly and not mistreat the lower classes. They want people to be able to directly elect their senators instead of the legislature in a state, so that people have more control over their senators, so that the people can remove them if they feel like they are doing a bad job or that they are corrupt or bought out by big business. They wanted initiatives and referendums. They want to be able to recall their politicians, which means kick them out of office if they thought they were doing a bad job. When Congress passed a law, they wanted to be able to vote on it afterwards to make sure the people supported the law that Congress had just passed. All right, so pretty radical stuff they want here. And they want to obviously see tariffs reduced as well, because they thought the tariffs were bad for society. All right. So basically, they're there to protect the little people. They want farmers and workers to have more of a voice, to have more of a say in society. 39. Why did the United States borrow gold from J.P. Morgan in the 1890s? Because we had a horrible panic in the 1890s. We almost ran out of gold. In an act of desperation, the U.S. government purchased millions of dollars in gold from Morgan and other bankers. We paid them millions of dollars in interest in order to do so. But it just showed you how dependent and reliant the U.S. government was on business and bankers, in that we're literally taking personal loans from bankers to keep our government functioning and afloat during this time. 40. What did each of the following policies do in the 1880s and 90s? The McKinley tariff raised our tariff rates to the highest ever. That is huge for industry. It demonstrated the government is still overwhelmingly supporting business and industry. It was devastating to farmers, right? Because we know that leads to higher prices for all of us paying inside our country. And of course, it leads to retaliatory tariffs that are passed by other countries against our farm products. Sherman Silver Purchase Act prints way more silver than ever before in our economy. This is something that farmers and populists wanted to see take place. However, not enough silver was printed to make it valuable enough or to have the effect that farmers had hoped for. We still were overwhelmingly reliant on gold to back up our money, which was so expensive that most farmers didn't really own any gold and could never really benefit from it. 41, what was the key issue in the election of 1896? It was whether we should stick with our gold standard, where we back up our money with gold, or else we should switch over to silver instead. Farmer and lower class people preferred silver. More expensive, I should say wealthier folks, business leaders, and politicians tended to support gold. They thought it was more stable, more steady. The Republican Party, led by McKinley, wanted to keep us on the gold standard. The Democratic Party, led by, remember, the Farmer's Choice, William Jennings Bryan, wanted to maintain a silver standard. Bryan gave a really famous Cross of Gold speech in which he basically likened farmers to Christ and said they're being crucified on a cross of gold by big business and government, that farmers are getting killed here, that not literally, that they're economically being destroyed and harmed by the decisions of big business, industry, and banks and politics. Despite Bryan's very famous speech, one of the most famous in our history, McKinley does win the election, the Republicans win the election, and so industry benefits, business benefits, the same people that controlled politics and our economy all the way through this era continue to do so when they win the election of 1896. And farmers kind of give up in 1896. After they lose this election, they become fractured, they become separated, they no longer unified. Many of them become bitter and angry and no longer want to be involved in politics again. And so farmers are going to continue to suffer. Agriculture is going to continue to suffer, while industry definitely improves and gains throughout this era. All right, folks, I think that's everything. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to sign off here. Happy studying. Big test on Wednesday.